Let's begin by saying that today is a significant date in the Chabad Hasidic calendar. Today is a Chabad Yom Tov. It is the 10th day of the month of Kislev. It's the day on which, in 1926, the second Chabad Rebbe, who was known as the Mittler Rebbe, or otherwise known as the Middle Rebbe, was the middle because he died a young man, and many of the Hasidim had actually three Rebbes. They'd had the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, and then their Rebbe, the Rebbe Menachem Mendel at Tzemach Tzedek. So he was known as the Middle Rebbe, but he was actually, for us, he was the second out of seven. Now, the Mittler Rebbe, Rabbi Dov Ber, was arrested and imprisoned for the usual crimes of spreading Judaism, opening Torah institutions, etc., under the Tsar's government. And eventually the Tsar commuted his sentence, and he was released with no criminal record after about 6 weeks of incarceration. And the day of his release was today. The day of his release was today, which is the 10th day of Kislev. And it's regarded then by Hasidim as being a day of liberation. So it's a day of great joy, of liberation, that's like embedded in the date, much like obviously in a different kind of way, a smaller way. We celebrate the redemption of Pesach every year, and the redemption of Hanukkah and so on. So Hasidim celebrated the days of the liberation of the Rebbes as being a liberation actually for the Hasidim as well, until today too. So today, 10th of Kislev, that's what that is about. But what I would like to talk to you about today is something about the week up ahead. And we're going to talk about, let somebody else in, just 1 second. There we go. Okay. To talk about the Parsha, and in this Parsha specifically, something that I'm sure has fascinated you as it's fascinated so many people always, is to just unpack from a little bit of a different angle the marriages of Yaakov Avinu, Jacob's marriages. Now, we all know the famous story of how Yaakov Avinu came to be married to more than one wife. Yaakov married Leah, but it was that he was duped. He was told that he was getting the one that he loved, that he wanted to marry, his real light of his life, Rachel, and he was duped. At the last minute, Lavan sent in Leah, and Leah married, or Yaakov married Leah under false pretenses. And I think that many people believe that up until today, this is actually the reason why a chosen, a groom, before he goes to the chuppah, goes to check who's under the veil. And he does what we call the bedekking, which takes place at every Jewish wedding, the bedekking, where the chosen says, okay, I know now that this is the one that I wanted. I'm not being fooled by anybody. And he's the one who places the veil on her head. If you think about it, that actually doesn't make that much sense. Because between the time of the bedekking and the chuppah, if anybody wanted to fool the chosen, they could still do it. You put a veil over her head. She comes to the chuppah completely in disguise and with her face covered. And she comes up to the chuppah and she stands next to him. And all he actually sees is when she puts out her finger, the finger of one can look like the finger of the other, especially, I suppose, with sisters. There's no identification of the actual face. Surely it would probably make more sense if that was the reason, is to actually lift up the veil under the chuppah and check before he puts the ring on the finger to say, okay, now I'm checking, before it's too late, I want to make sure that this is the right one. So actually, probably the putting of the veil on the collar has got very little to do with the Rachel and Leah story. I'm just putting it out there. Most people believe that that's the reason. It's probably got very little to do with that. There are all sorts of other reasons. It's the reason of tzniut, of modesty. It's the reason of making sure that the chassan is not fooled by beauty as being, or physical beauty as being the only reason for marriage, and so on. There are a number of different reasons which probably are stronger than the Rachel and Leah story. But having said that, our sages raise a fascinating and important argument about these weddings. And that is that Torah forbids a man from marrying. Now, this is before the obligation to only marry one wife. A man was always forbidden to marry two sisters. You know that? I mean, yeah, it's hard to think about because we're used to this idea that, you can only marry one wife, or one wife at a time, let's say. You can't have you can't have more than one wife at a time. That's our rule that we've taken upon from a gzeira, that decree that came much later. But according to Torah, one of the things that's embedded in Torah law is that a man cannot marry two sisters. Not allowed to marry two sisters. Even if you're allowed to marry more than one wife, you're not allowed to marry two sisters. Now, why would it be that you're not allowed to marry two sisters? So a lot of people would say that it's borderline incestuous, right? To marry two sisters, you're kind of there seems to be a real deep spiritual reason, but there's also a very practical psychological reason. And that is that there's going to be jealousy. The sisters are going to argue. In fact, there's a whole lot of Torah law that deals with the complex issues of brothers and sisters and their marriages one to the other. It's not uncommon for sisters to marry two brothers. It happens sometimes. And I guess that comes from the fact that when a family gets used to one good set of machatonim, they don't mind taking them back again. And therefore, they have the same machatonim twice. It's okay. But there are rules and regulations. For instance, a man, two brothers marrying two sisters, halacha says that they shouldn't live in the same town. And the reason that they shouldn't live in the same town is because of the psychological issues, the jealousy, etc. It's too close to home, and this one is going to be jealous of that one and whatever. You know, when people get involved in businesses together, if there's a family business, very often the people in the business start some kind of a fight, and very often there's a disagreement. When it's between brothers, very often it ends up in a world war. Why does it end up in a world war? Well, usually, often, a time, it's because the whole family gets involved. The wives get involved. The one wants to know why that one is getting a bigger share. The other one wants to know why this one was appointed as the MD and you're the schlepper. This one wants to know why it seems to be that you're working harder and you get a lesser salary. That can only happen when you have wives, brothers, sisters, husbands and wives all involved. Now imagine if you make that even more incestuous from a social point of view, where you have brothers and sisters married to each other, it becomes far too complex. And we actually see from the story of Rachel and Leah just how right that assessment actually is. Because there are deep-rooted social issues that Yaakov Avinu has with his wives. And it happens later. There's jealousy between them. The kids have arguments. Isn't the whole story of Yosef HaTzadik, of Joseph, based on some of the jealousies that existed that were deep-rooted from Rachel and Leah, and the fact that Yaakov favored the one, he preferred Rachel over Leah, etc. Why was this allowed even then? And it becomes more complex. It becomes more complex because Rashi is the one, Rashi, our foremost Torah commentator, is the one who tells us that that Yaakov kept the whole Torah. He tells us later on that Yaakov says, Im Lovon Garti, and Rashi says, Taryag mitzvah shamarti. I may have lived all the time with Lovon, and all the time that he was fooling me, and all the time that he was playing around with and kept on moving the goalposts. I worked for him for all those years, but throughout the time that I was there, I kept the 613 mitzvahs. I kept the whole Torah. If Yaakov is going to be saying, or Rashi is going to be saying, that Yaakov kept the whole Torah, how is it possible that he didn't keep this basic rule and he married two sisters? How could he have married two sisters? Let's add another complication. An added complication is we see that Rashi actually, that Torah actually tells us that Yaakov didn't only marry two sisters. Yaakov married 4 women. Yes? Yaakov married Rachel and Leah, and he had 2 who are referred to as the handmaids. He married 2 other women who were the handmaids to the sisters, and they were Bilhah and Zilpah. So Yaakov Avinu actually had 4 wives: Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. But no one other than the great Torah commentator Rashi tells us that in fact Bilhah and Zilpah were also sisters of Rachel and Leah. Turns out that according to most Torah commentators, now not everybody agrees with it, but according to most Torah commentators and the best of the best, they tell us that in fact Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, married not 2, but 4 sisters. All of them were Lavan's daughters. So, what they say is Hadre Kusha Leduchte, that who's coming in there? 1 second. So we've got the whole story becomes even more complicated, and that is that our question is strengthened even more, and that is, if Yaakov Avinu, if Jacob was keeping the 613 mitzvahs, how could he marry sisters? Never mind 2, but even more so 4. How could he marry these 4 sisters? What are we talking about here? What's going on? Let's try and explain, or let's perhaps try and provide some of the answers that are given by great sages. One of our sages points out, one of our Torah commentators points out, he says that in fact, our forefathers only kept the 613 mitzvahs, the whole Torah, when they were in Israel. And this is now the opinion of the Ramban, not the Rambam, but the Ramban. Tells us that our forefathers kind of saw every rule of Torah applying only in Israel. Outside of Israel, it didn't apply. So he says, so therefore, because Yaakov Avinu was in Choron, he was in Iran, Iraq, that neighborhood, the rules of Israel didn't apply. And so he could marry, that's why he dafka married outside. But we come back to our question that we phrased before, and that was that Rashi goes out of his way to tell us that Yaakov Avinu kept the whole Torah, even though he was in Choron. So why is he telling us that? And on this point of marrying more than one sister, or marrying 2 or more sisters rather, Rashi makes no comment. He doesn't tell us why. He doesn't give a comment on it. He doesn't say, this was the reason, that was the reason. He doesn't make a comment at all. It's as though he doesn't even notice that Yaakov is supposedly not keeping to a Torah law, albeit that the Torah laws only came to earth later on. But we know that our forefathers supposedly kept the Torah before it was given at Mount Sinai. How is this possible? How does it align? And what are we actually talking about? One of our commentators says our forefathers were allowed to keep things that aren't specifically mentioned until later on. And this would fit now if we think about, the Rashi says he writes for a Ben Chamish Lemikra, for a 5-year-old child who's reading the story. And a 5-year-old child now reading from the beginning of the Torah up until now, he's never heard anything about not marrying sisters. The rule doesn't apply yet. It only comes much later, where we're told that a man is not allowed to marry more than one woman from the same parents. So he's not allowed to marry sisters. So it only came later. So up until now. So now the child doesn't have the question. There's no question. Okay, good. But it's a very, very thin kind of an answer. It doesn't really give us much credibility at all. There's another fascinating concept, which is quite an important one for us to think about. And that is that according to some, you know what happened over here was that the women marrying Yaakov had to go through a conversion. Now, conversion means that when a person converts to Judaism, they actually spiritually are changed neshamas. The souls are different. And in effect, according to Jewish law, they actually have no spiritual connection anymore with their previous family. So technically speaking, two sisters, both of whom convert to Judaism, are not sisters anymore. And therefore, since they are newborn babies, they're newborn souls, they came into being at the date of their conversion. In fact, a person who converts to Judaism keeps the day on which they convert as being their birthday. That's when they were born into Judaism. Therefore, maybe they're not related. So these two sisters were not related to each other, so they could marry them. We have a couple of problems with that answer. And that is that, once again, it would have been the simplest thing in the world for Rashi just to mention it, and he doesn't. And the second thing is that nowhere is there recorded the idea that they converted. And it's an interesting thing to note that if we're going to go down that line, we've got to ask the question, why Avraham Avinu, Abraham, is still called the son of his father Terach. Avraham Avinu, Abraham, still has to show some sort of respect to Terach, even though he converts out of the family. So if Terach was his father, then I'm sorry to tell you, but Rachel and Leah were still sisters. And the Torah still seems to refer to them as sisters even afterwards. So again, a bit thin on proof of the fact that maybe these girls were kind of brand new births. They were newborn babes when he married them, and therefore they weren't actually related. Doesn't seem to fit completely. So we need to kind of explore, I think, in order to answer this question, we need to explore what actually our forefathers did for it to be deemed that they kept the whole Torah. And here we're going to go into a very, very fascinating brief study or thought about what did it mean that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov kept the whole Torah. Were they keeping it because it was God's obligation? Or were they keeping it because it was their own kind of stringency on themselves? Now think about it for a moment. God didn't instruct Avraham Avinu to give himself a bris until he was 99 years old. He surely, if he's keeping the whole Torah, he should have known about bris. Why does he wait? Why does Avraham Avinu wait until he is 99 years old to give himself a bris? Surely he should have done it earlier. As soon as you know that there's the concept of bris, in Judaism. It's written in the Torah. If Avraham Avinu knew the Torah, surely he's got to give himself a bris. But he doesn't. He waits until it's instructed. And when it's instructed to him directly, then he gives himself a bris. Now, our sages explain why. It's a fascinating reason. The reason they say is because according to the laws, and there were only 7 laws that all people had to obey up until then, up until Torah was given. The laws were, included in the laws was to the 7 Noahide laws, the 7 laws of Noah. There was a law that you're not allowed to spill blood. Avraham Avinu took that to the nth degree. You're not allowed to spill blood was even that he's not allowed to spill his own blood. To give himself a circumcision, to give himself a bris, was considered as spilling blood, and therefore he was conflicted. There was the conflict of a law of not spilling blood, and the rule that he himself knew existed in Torah of taking a stringency upon himself, of giving himself a bris, and he had to go with the rule of thumb, which was maybe a bad choice of words there, but he had to go with the rule. He had to go with the law of not spilling blood versus a stringency that he was going to take upon himself to obey God's eventual law of giving yourself a bris. So if you ask the average Jew, and let me ask you this question as well, think about, why is it that we as Jews still practice the idea of giving our children a bris? Why does a boy get a bris? Most people will say, because Avraham Avinu was instructed to give a bris. Yes, Avraham Avinu was told, give yourself a bris, and give a bris, give a circumcision to your children, and your son Yitzchak must have it when he's 8 days old, and so on. But in fact, that's incorrect. The reason why we give our children a bris today is because the Torah says you must give your child a bris. We're not doing it for a historical reason. We're not doing it because Avraham Avinu did it. We're doing it because the Torah specifically commanded us to do that bris. Now, when it came to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov Avinu, they kept rules and regulations from the Torah as a stringency upon themselves until such time as they specifically were commanded in it. It didn't become, and it wasn't for them, a command like we have the commands of Torah from the time that the Torah was given to us on Mount Sinai. Yaakov Avinu had the following huge moral dilemma when he wanted to marry Rachel. Let's unpack it and think about it carefully in our own terms. Imagine Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, is standing under the chuppah. He is presented with a bride who is veiled. And the bride that he's presented with who is veiled, he eventually finds out is actually Leah. He's been given the wrong woman. Could you imagine what went through the guy's mind? Rachel, we're told, had given her sister certain secret codes. Now, Yaakov knew that his father-in-law was a no-goodnik. He knew that his father-in-law was a con man, a charlatan, a liar. He knew that there was a possibility that somebody could try to pull the veil over his eyes. He knew that might happen. And so he gave Rachel secret codes. He gave her passwords. And he said to her, these are the passwords. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I want to see that you answer me, then I'll know for sure that it's you. So he was confident that he was for away on this thing and nobody could trick him. She had the passwords. When Leah came under the chuppah, he asked the questions, or at night afterwards, he asked her the questions, and she had all the right answers. How did she have all the right answers? Because Rachel realized that her sister was going to be disgraced. Could you imagine standing under the chuppah, it's the wrong person. Who's the one who's going to suffer the most? Leah. Leah's been forced into this position. Rachel was prepared to forgo, think about it, her life, her marriage, her love, everything, to not disgrace her sister in any way. She gave her sister the secret codes, and the sister knew those secret codes, and she said them correctly. And Yaakov Avinu therefore went through with the marriage to Leah without realizing that it was the wrong woman. Now imagine the moral dilemma when he finds out. He finds out that this is Leah and it's not Rachel. What would you do? What does he do? He could have kicked her out, gone back and said, listen, you've sold me the wrong woman. I'm going to take you to court. Let's go to a din Torah. Let's go to a court and let's have this marriage annulled. I'm being duped. I didn't know who I was. You married me to the wrong person. But in fact, Yaakov doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He opts rather for a different course of action. And that is, he says, I will marry Rachel as well. Let me work another 7 years, or whatever it is that he's eventually charged, and I'm happy to do that. And Lavan says to him, you know what, we don't marry right away, wait another week, etc., the week of Sheva Brachas. He's got to wait, and eventually he marries Rachel as well. Now, let's look at this from this moral, social, psychological point of view. It took tremendous courage and guts and fortitude and sensitivity not to throw out Leah and to actually marry Rachel. But our sages raise an even bigger issue. And they say here that Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, had a bigger moral dilemma, a bigger issue that he had to deal with. That bigger issue was he had made a promise to Rachel that he would marry her. He promised her that they would get married. By now saying, I'm married to Leah, and I'm going to keep to the Torah law of not marrying two sisters. I'm going to keep to that. I am not going to marry Rachel. I'm doing a bigger sin than I could ever imagine. I promised her that I would marry her. If I promised her that I would marry her, the only way for me is to step down from my high horse of my stringency that at this stage I'm taking upon myself, which is God's Torah law, which is only going to be given later. I haven't been told specifically that I can't marry two sisters. And I have made a promise to Rachel that I will marry her. There's only one option. I have to break the future Torah law and marry Rachel as well as Leah. I have to forego that stringency. That is a stringency that I've taken upon myself. But I have to keep to the moral, ethical thing, which is I promised that I would not deceive, and I promised that I would marry Rachel, and therefore he marries Rachel as well as Leah. So let's think about it. We do learn moral and ethical behavior from our forefathers. We do learn moral and ethical behavior from our mothers, from Sarah, from Rivka, from Rachel, from Leah. We learn a tremendous amount. Yes, we may not have that as Torah law, as in, why do we give our sons a bris, as we mentioned before? But their moral judgment, their ethical judgment is of paramount importance to us, and we certainly learn from that, from them. Yaakov Avinu teaches us something fantastic here. Remember, we mentioned before, The power of Jewish law, of Torah law, on our forefathers, on Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, is not like it is on us. We have no option in keeping the Torah law because we were specifically instructed in that Torah law. They weren't. At that stage, they were keeping it in a way of a stringency upon themselves. This was what you would call today a chumrah. They're keeping it in order to be strict upon themselves. They want to live a high and special spiritual life. And that's why they were keeping to those rules that they knew would come into being at a later stage. But there was the moral, ethical value of society at the time, which was that you got to keep your word. Strangely enough, even in the discussion that Yaakov Avinu has with his father-in-law when they're going to leave, Yaakov Avinu gets Lavan to even admit that deceiving somebody is not so kosher, it's not the right thing to do. Yaakov has to set a tone for Torah, for us, for his descendants all the way down to have to understand and to value. And that's if there is something that is a societal moral value, it is a very, very powerful thing. If there is a moral value and something moral that is taken upon by society, as long as it doesn't conflict with Torah law, it's something that we have to do. And we have to be careful that we don't say, well, it's my stringency upon myself, and therefore that's what counts more than anything else. This is what I have to do. No, Torah says you've got to take into account the moral value, the ethical value of society, the mores of society at the time. As long as they're not in conflict with Torah law, we've got to take them into account as well. There's something more to it than that. Very often in today's day and age, so here's a bit more of a practical application. There are people who take upon themselves what we will call chumras. Chumras are where you're going to be very, very strict upon yourself in kashrus, in the laws of Shabbos, in whatever it is, but going beyond the letter of the law. I'm going to do things way above and beyond. I'm going to be fanatical about certain things. You want to be fanatical? You can be fanatical for yourself. But you're not allowed to let it impact on others. As soon as there's an impact on other people to their detriment, you're in the no-starter zone of Torah thinking. When it comes to the observance of a Torah law, that's not negotiable. We're not allowed to break that. But when it comes to a chumrah, when it comes to a stringency, I can do it for myself, but I can't make it to the detriment of others. Let me give you an example. We have a concept in town, in Johannesburg and around the world or whatever, something called Mahadran kosher. If I want to keep Mahadran kosher, I can do it gesundheit, I'm allowed to, there's absolutely no problem. But can I force it on you to have to pay extra for Mahadran kosher meat or products when it's not actually law? It's something that I want to take upon myself as a chumrah, as a stringency. Do I have the authority to enforce it on a community? Make you, for instance, pay more for it? I'm not allowed to do that. It's clear from the story of Rachel and Leah. When it came to the clash between something that is a personal growth stringency, a personal spiritual stringency, I'm not allowed to let that impact on what are known as the mores of society or the standards of the community and so on. I have to make sure that those take pride of place and those take precedence. So it's a fascinating thing. We see that while we are obligated, that we're not allowed to have a man marrying more than one wife or marrying two sisters and all the rules and regulations that apply to it, we see that the example of it, of Yaakov and Rachel and Leah, has a much, much deeper overtone. Yaakov had to take into account so much more. His promise, the fact that he wasn't going to allow himself to be seen as a cheat or a scandalous kind of a person. He wasn't going to do anything that would go against the standards of the time even. And he wasn't going to allow himself to sink into the thing that he had made a promise that he wasn't going to keep. This Yaakov Avinu does. And this is the way that our sages and the Rebbe, for instance, answers this question. How was it that Yaakov was able to marry two sisters? So we have to remember that there are standards within society. So for instance, you've got this whole thing during Corona, and during the last 8-9 months or whatever, where you have a thing that the government, for instance, or the country, or even the rabbi said, don't have minyanim, don't have a minyan, and don't allow it to be a place where you're spreading this virus. So until such time as the shuls actually opened, there were certain chachamim, wise Alex, and very spiritual people around the world who said, no, we're not going to allow that. We're not going to tolerate that we can't have a minyan. We're going to do this in defiance of the mores of the society. In my humble opinion, they were totally wrong. It was incorrect. You can't put your own spiritual prowess over and above a basic rule and a basic mitzvah. There was a basic mitzvah of pikuach nefesh, of saving a life, which overrules all else, plus the fact that society, including the rabbis, the chief rabbi, the Beit Din, and so on, had said, no, we should not have minyanim because there is a possibility that we may be spreading this virus. We've got to obey the rules of the government. And the same thing today. There are people who think that they're very wise. The government says wear a mask when you're in company with people and when you see people and so on. And they say, you know what, I don't have to do it. On the contrary, that becomes when there's a social law like that, this is something that's absolutely obligatory from a Torah point of view. We dare not walk out without it. We dare not be seen without it, except, of course, on Zoom, when it's just at the moment, while I can see some of you, it's just me and my computer that are talking to each other, and my computer doesn't have to wear a mask at all. But when we walk outside, we've got to make sure that we conform, that we do these things, that we're not seen to be abrogating the rules and regulations and the mores of society, certainly when they don't clash with Torah and they don't clash with my mitzvahs. So hopefully we will learn all the lessons that there are to learn from this beautiful and filled parsha with all sorts of moral discussions and ethical discussions and honesty discussions and Torah discussions and marriage discussions and so on. This is a very, very powerful and incredible parsha, and it's the parsha in which the Jewish people of the future are actually built, because this is the parsha that contains the birth of the tribes of Israel. This is the parsha of Yaakov Avinu now setting up Bnei Yisrael. The Jewish people are set up, and we've got to remember that we are based not only on Torah and on mitzvahs and on love for every person, but we're also based on an obedience to rules and regulations, an obedience to moral issues, an obedience to ethical behavior, an obedience to all of that, as much as we are to all the things that are written in Torah. We've got to make sure we also keep these things. If I've made a promise to somebody, I've got to keep it. If I've said I'm going to do something, I've got to have integrity. And these are the rules of integrity that we actually have to have, which in many, many ways overrule rules of Torah. So hopefully we've learned something. It's been great sharing some time with you again this week. Look forward to doing anything again next week, and I wish you a good Shabbos up ahead and a great week to come. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi Katz. Good Shabbos to everybody.
Good Shabbos to everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Shabbos.
Keep well.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Keep well.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Keep well, everybody.